My sister sat in the center of a pitch-black 104-degree canvas tent in Dallas, watching her new father-in-law scream in our dad's face. 5,000 miles away, I rested a crystal flute of vintage champagne against the cool limestone of a terrace in Provence, watching her disaster broadcast live on a phone screen. My family thought they had won. They thought their vanity had finally pushed me out of the picture for good. But to understand how their arrogance financed my acquisition of their prized lake house, we have to rewind to Austin, Texas, 1 year earlier. Before I tell you how silence became my sharpest weapon, drop a comment below and let me know your age and where you are listening from. Welcome back to Amanda Told Stories. I read every single comment. The late summer heat pressed heavy on the hill country the afternoon Ethan proposed. He did not hire a hidden photographer or drop to one knee in a crowded, overpriced restaurant. He led me beneath the sprawling branches of a centuries-old live oak on a secluded ridge overlooking the river. The ring he slipped onto my finger was an heirloom, an emerald-cut diamond set in platinum. It possessed an enduring clarity devoid of flashy modern facets, meticulously chosen, just like him. 10 minutes after that private moment, we pulled up the gravel driveway to my parents' ranch. Charles and Diane Fox lived for optics. Their home was a stone-clad monument to Texas posturing, adorned with wrought iron and imported leather. We gathered on the back patio. The air hung thick with humidity and the smell of smoked brisket. I drew a breath, preparing to lift my left hand and share the news. Before the words could form, my younger sister Harper stood up. She tapped her sweet tea glass with a butter knife. The sharp ping sliced through the ambient cicada hum. "Preston and I are getting married," she announced. She thrust her hand forward, blinding the patio with a cloudy, trendy, 4-carat halo ring. Preston Montgomery, a Dallas real estate heir with a penchant for pastel polo shirts and inherited confidence, beamed beside her. The stone on her finger was oversized, fragile, and rapidly depreciating. A perfect mirror of their relationship, my mother Diane shrieked. She bolted from her wrought iron chair and sprinted to the kitchen, returning moments later with a bottle of champagne she had ostensibly saved for a special occasion. She popped the cork exclusively for Harper, pouring flutes for Preston and Charles while gushing over the Montgomery family pedigree. I remained seated at the edge of the patio. I slid my left hand beneath the linen napkin on my lap. The emerald-cut stone pressed cool against my thigh. I was not angry. I was observant. This was merely the first pebble of conflict, a continuation of a lifelong pattern where my existence served only as background noise to Harper's main act. Then Harper took a sip of her champagne and laid her claim. "We are thinking spring," she declared, her eyes darting toward me. "May. The weather will be perfect for a tent." May was the exact month I had whispered to my mother 3 weeks prior, testing the waters for my own timeline. Diane did not flinch. She merely nodded, already calculating the social capital a Montgomery wedding would bring to her country club circle. Under the table, Ethan reached for my hidden hand. His thumb brushed over the platinum band, a silent question asking if we should intervene, if we should speak up and claim our space. I shook my head. A millimeter of movement. Let her have the date. Let them build their fragile empire on rented land. I realized right then that rage was a useless emotion without a strategy. My silent erasure was about to become my sharpest weapon. 2 weeks slipped by in a deceptive calm. I was reviewing a predictive modeling algorithm in my downtown Austin office when the family group chat lit up. A digital invitation prototype flashed across my screen. Elegant cursive script scrolled across a faux parchment background. Preston and Harper, May 14th, the Dallas Country Club. I stared at the illuminated glass. May 14th was the exact Saturday I had quietly discussed with my mother over iced tea just 21 days prior. The country club was a predictable choice for my sister. It featured sweeping manicured lawns, crystal chandeliers, and a membership fee designed to keep the right people in and the wrong people out. It was a factory for producing generic, expensive social events. I felt a familiar cold tightening in my chest. Not surprise, inevitability. I picked up the phone and dialed my mother's number. She answered on the second ring. The distinct clink of sterling silver against china echoed in the background. She was likely at a brunch meeting with her charity committee. "Mom?" I said, keeping my voice level. "Harper just sent a save the date for May 14th. We talked about that weekend for Ethan and me." Diane let out a breath that sounded like a sigh of profound burden. "Oh, Lindsay, we knew you would notice. Harper just could not find another open weekend that accommodated her vision." The pause she left hung heavy with unspoken rank. "Her guest list is enormous, sweetie. She is marrying a Montgomery. They have expectations. You and Ethan are just so much more flexible. A smaller affair can happen any time." Flexible. The word was a weapon dressed as a compliment. In my family, flexible meant expendable. It meant my milestones were penciled in while Harper's were carved in marble. It meant my time, my desires, and my life were meant to bend around the rigid demands of their vanity. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand fairness. I simply told her I had already set my heart on that weekend and intended to keep it. Diane scoffed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Be reasonable, Lindsay. Do not make this difficult." I ended the call without promising anything. Ethan walked into my office a few minutes later, carrying 2 coffees. He took one look at my posture, rigid against the desk, and set the cups down. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply stood beside me, a steady, grounding presence. "They took the date," I murmured. Ethan crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "And what are we going to do about it?" he asked. His tone held no panic. He knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. "We are keeping it," I replied. Preston Montgomery represented everything my parents valued. A recognized surname, a membership to the right golf course, and a trust fund they assumed was bottomless. They were eager to merge our family name with his, blindly trusting the veneer of Dallas high society. They never bothered to look beneath the surface. My data background taught me to always verify the numbers. A quick digital footprint check revealed that Preston spent more time on a yacht than in an office. But my parents were blinded by the glare of his inherited status. The formal retaliation arrived 2 hours later. Not a phone call, but a text message. A cowardly medium for a final decree. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the Texas sun glint off the glass facades of the city below. My screen illuminated with Diane's words. "Your sister's wedding is the priority for this family. She is marrying into the Montgomerys. We cannot attend yours if you refuse to move the date." I read the sentence 3 times. The rejection was clear. I was expected to fold. My parents were willing to boycott my wedding to secure their social standing with Preston's family. They were issuing an ultimatum designed to force me into submission through the threat of public familial abandonment. The physical sensation of reading that text message was profound. It did not break my heart. It calcified it. For 30 years, I had played the role of the dependable background character, the daughter who demanded nothing and received exactly that. Seeing the ultimatum spelled out in stark digital text freed me from any remaining obligation. Blood might make you related, but loyalty is what makes you family. My parents had just legally and emotionally severed our ties over a country club reservation. I unlocked my phone. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The old version of me would have typed a paragraph of hurt feelings begging for compromise. I would have twisted myself into knots, trying to accommodate them to earn a fraction of the attention they lavished on Harper. Instead, I typed 3 sentences. That is fine. I am keeping my date. Enjoy the dinner. I hit send and placed the device face down on my mahogany desk. Ethan watched me, his expression unreadable but proud. They mistook my brief compliance for submission. They assumed my silence meant I was retreating to lick my wounds in the shadows. They assumed I would quietly elope at a local courthouse, too embarrassed to host an event without my parents present. They assumed wrong. My family knew very little about my actual life. To Charles and Diane Fox, I was a mid-level IT manager. They thought I spent my days fixing server errors and writing code in a cramped cubicle. My father frequently referred to my career as a cute computer hobby, comparing it unfavorably to his vast ranching operations. They did not know that 3 months before Ethan proposed, I had sold my data infrastructure startup for an 8-figure sum. The acquisition was executed under a strict non-disclosure agreement through a holding company I established. The money sat quietly in diversified accounts, generating interest faster than my father could breed cattle. I built a predictive analytics tool that revolutionized supply chain logistics for a major tech conglomerate. My sweat equity had translated into generational wealth. I never corrected their assumptions because their ignorance offered me a shield. In a family that measured worth by visible price tags, my invisible wealth was the only thing they could not touch. They pitied my modest sedan, not realizing I preferred anonymity. They judged my unbranded clothing, unaware of the bespoke tailoring and premium fabrics. Building a tech company required grueling hours, sleepless nights, and relentless problem-solving. I built my empire in the dark, while Harper built her brand on our father's credit cards. When the buyout cleared, I stared at the bank balance until the numbers blurred. Financial freedom meant I no longer needed their approval. Now it meant I possessed the resources to outmaneuver them entirely. I was not merely keeping my wedding date. I was upgrading the battlefield. If they wanted a war of optics, we would have a war of optics. While Diane spent her afternoons bragging to her country club friends about Harper marrying into old money, I was sitting at my desk executing international wire transfers. The Dallas Country Club would serve dried chicken breast and overcooked asparagus to 300 sweating guests inside a humid tent. I opened my secure banking portal and authorized a payment to a Michelin-starred culinary team based in Lyon. The menu would feature black truffle risotto, locally sourced Mediterranean sea bass, and wine harvested from vines planted before Texas was even a state. I watched the loading bar on the screen as the funds cleared. A 6-figure deposit moving seamlessly across the globe. There was no hesitation in my chest, only the cool, calculated satisfaction of a strategist arranging the board. The quiet erasure I had endured my whole life was no longer a source of pain. It was a tactical advantage. By forcing me out of their spotlight, they had unknowingly given me the darkness I needed to set the perfect snare. I picked up my phone and dialed a number with a country code my mother would never recognize. The voice on the other end answered in crisp, professional French. I confirmed the catering deposit and asked to speak directly with the estate manager to discuss the floral arrangements. My parents believed they were cutting me off. They did not realize I had already crossed an ocean. I bypassed the usual chaos of commercial international terminals. The private aviation suite at Austin Bergstrom provided the quiet I needed. I sank into the leather seat of a chartered flight bound for Marseille. As the aircraft climbed over the Texas plains, I pictured my parents sitting in their sprawling living room. They were likely hovering over calculators and spreadsheets right now. The Montgomery family demanded excellence, and my father was draining his accounts to manufacture the illusion of limitless cash. Charles measured success by the size of his cattle herds and the roar of his diesel trucks. To him, wealth was something you shouted from a mountaintop. I preferred to keep my treasures silent. The Mediterranean air greeted me with the scent of sea salt and crushed rosemary. A discreet black town car drove me east from the airport, winding through the sun-baked hills of southern France. We turned down a long driveway, lined with ancient cypress trees. The towering iron gates parted without a sound. Before me stood the Château de la Roche. I purchased the estate 2 years ago, using a fraction of my tech acquisition funds. The 17th century limestone fortress sat nestled within 60 acres of vibrant purple lavender fields. It cost $14 million in cash. I bought it specifically because it was the antithesis of everything my family worshipped. There were no gilded ceilings or ostentatious chandeliers. The beauty here lived in the hand-carved wooden beams, the worn stone floors, and the centuries of quiet history echoing in the courtyards. It was a fortress. It was mine. Growing up in a household where love was distributed based on pageantry, I learned to seek refuge in solitude. Harper thrived in the spotlight. She needed applause to breathe. I learned to code in my bedroom while she practiced her pageant waves in the hallway. That early isolation trained my mind to build complex systems. It taught me how to construct a secure environment where external noise could not penetrate. The chateau was the physical manifestation of that mental sanctuary. It was a place where my worth was not determined by a country club membership or a shiny engagement ring. I walked the length of the grand gallery, running my fingers along the cool, tapestry-draped walls. My wedding planner, a brilliant woman named Geneviève, followed closely with her tablet. We needed to finalize the invitations. The list was deliberately sparse. I invited the core engineering team from my former startup. These were the people who helped me build my fortune, line by line. I added Ethan's parents, a pair of retired educators from Oregon who treated me with genuine warmth. Then I selected the few members of the Fox family who had always seen through Harper's golden child routine. My Aunt Susan, a pragmatist who ran a successful accounting firm, and my cousin Rachel, who despised Dallas high society politics. I knew inviting them would spark a firestorm back home, but the guest list was a calculated maneuver. I was calling roll to see who valued loyalty over spectacle. My phone vibrated in my pocket. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I let the call roll to voicemail, preferring to hear her words without having to participate in her performance. A moment later, the notification chimed. I pressed play while standing on the terrace overlooking the Rhone Valley. Diane's voice spilled from the speaker, dripping with fake sympathy. "Lindsay, sweetie," she began, her tone stretched thin. "Harper ran into a small issue with her floral arrangements. She really needs to use the designer you mentioned last week. The Montgomerys expect a certain aesthetic, and Harper cannot compromise. I am sure you understand. Maybe you can grab some nice blooms from the grocery store. It fits your rustic budget better anyway." I held the phone away from my ear. The dramatic irony was so thick I could almost taste it. I was not standing alone on the terrace. Beside me stood Monsieur Laurent. He was not a local vendor. He was the chief botanist for a royal palace in Monaco. He had flown in that morning exclusively to evaluate the soil composition of the chateau gardens. He needed to ensure the white orchids and rare blue hydrangeas would thrive during the ceremony. He was pointing out a patch of fertile earth near the fountain when my mother suggested I buy carnations from a supermarket. I smiled. It was a genuine, bright smile. I translated my mother's suggestion into French for Monsieur Laurent. He chuckled, a rich, deep sound that echoed off the stone walls. "It is good to have humble roots, Madame Fox," he replied, adjusting his silk scarf. I instructed him to double the orchid order. I did not text my mother back to argue. I sent a simple thumbs-up emoji. I wanted her to feel victorious. I wanted her to believe she had successfully stolen my joy. The theft of a floral designer was just the beginning of Harper's campaign. She realized I was still planning a wedding for May 14th. The idea that I might host an event on the same day threatened her fragile ego. She needed to ensure no one in our social circle would even consider attending my ceremony. By Tuesday afternoon, my cousin Rachel called me. Her voice was laced with disgust. Harper was actively working the Dallas rumor mill.
"Did you know you are throwing a cheap elopement out of pure spite?" Rachel asked.
Because that is what your sister told the entire bridal shower yesterday. She claims you are deeply jealous of Preston and his trust fund. She said you are dragging Ethan to a public park somewhere just to steal her spotlight, and that you cannot even afford a real reception. I leaned against the heavy oak doors of the chateau library, listening to the outrage in my cousin's voice. Harper was weaving a narrative of poverty and bitterness. She was painting me as the pathetic older sister trying desperately to compete with her high society triumph. The old me would have defended myself. The old me would have posted photos of the chateau online to prove her wrong. The woman standing in France knew better. Every lie she told was adding gunpowder to a trap I was building beneath her feet. I let her spin the web. If I corrected the record now, they would change their behavior. They would pretend to support me just to access my resources. I needed them to act on their true impulses. I wanted them utterly complacent. I needed my father to continue signing checks he could not back up. I needed Harper to demand more ice sculptures, more imported caviar, more tents. I needed them to stretch their financial limits until the strings snapped. But Preston Montgomery was hiding secrets of his own. His family was not the bottomless well of cash my parents believed them to be. The Montgomery real estate empire was leveraged to the breaking point. A new storm was gathering in Texas. Preston was marrying Harper for one reason alone. He thought my father was wealthy enough to bail his family out of ruin. They were two sinking ships tying their anchors together while telling the world they were building a luxury yacht. The collision course was set, and the first major crack in their facade was about to appear. The illusion of wealth in Texas is often built on a foundation of dry dust and leverage. Preston Montgomery came from a lineage that constructed towering office parks during the oil boom of the 1980s. To my parents, the Montgomery name represented an apex of high society achievement. They saw country club memberships, private golf tutorials, and a legacy of untouchable prominence. What Charles and Diane did not know was that Preston's inheritance existed primarily on paper. The commercial real estate market had shifted, leaving the Montgomery portfolio hollow. Their glass buildings sat half empty, while exorbitant maintenance costs drained their liquid capital. Preston was not marrying my sister for love, or even for her pageant-trained smile. He was marrying Harper because he mistakenly believed my father was flush with cash. Preston had his eyes firmly fixed on our family crown jewel, the Hill Country Lake House. It was a sprawling cedar and glass retreat perched on a prime waterfront lot, offering panoramic views of the water. To the Montgomerys, that property represented untapped equity, a lifeline they could eventually mortgage to save their sinking ship. They assumed Harper, being the obvious golden child, would inherit the estate outright. They were tying their anchor to a vessel they thought was unsinkable. The tragic comedy of their union was that both families were playing a high-stakes game of poker with empty wallets. The profound irony was that Charles Fox was drowning in his own private financial storm. My father's ranching operation projected rural prosperity, but the reality was stark and unforgiving. A brutal 3-year drought had decimated the grazing pastures, forcing him to purchase imported feed at premium prices just to keep his cattle alive. Surging property taxes on his vast acreage were bleeding his accounts dry. His heavy-duty diesel trucks gleamed in the driveway, but the local bank held the titles to every single one of them. He was desperately cash poor, clinging to a facade of pastoral royalty. Harper cared nothing for agricultural profit margins or fluctuating interest rates. She only cared about aesthetics and the envy of her peers. Her wedding demands escalated daily, turning into a grotesque display of consumption. She required hand-carved ice sculptures shaped like swans to flank the reception entrance, an item that cost more than my first car. She insisted on industrial air conditioning units to cool the outdoor pavilion, claiming the Texas heat would ruin the guests' formal attire. She demanded imported silk table linens, a custom monogram dance floor, and a 5-course plated dinner featuring prime Wagyu beef. Charles signed every incoming invoice with a shaking hand. He was terrified that if he told her no, the Montgomery family would discover his insolvency and cancel the nuptials. He spent his evenings locked in his study, nursing cheap scotch while hiding past-due notices from Diane. He was funding a charade to impress in-laws who were equally broke. While my father quietly panicked in his dark office, Harper directed her frantic energy toward destroying my event. The petty vendor wars became her primary obsession. She operated under the delusion that I was struggling to organize a pathetic backyard gathering in Austin. She wanted to ensure my failure was total and inescapable. I decided to turn her spite into entertainment. I began tossing out carefully crafted red herrings to keep her occupied and distracted from my actual plans. During a brief phone call with my mother, I intentionally mentioned a popular local country fusion band. I manufactured a sigh of relief and stated I was thrilled they had an opening for May 14th. I praised their lead singer and talked about how affordable their acoustic set would be. I knew Diane would relay the information to my sister before I even hung up the phone. Less than 24 hours later, the band leader sent me an awkward, stumbling email. He stated a wealthy client had offered double his standard rate to secure an exclusive contract for that weekend. He apologized profusely for breaking our preliminary agreement. I replied, with a brief, polite note wishing him well. I did not shed a single tear. I had never intended to hire them. My actual musical entertainment was a prestigious string quartet based in Paris. They normally performed private concerts for European dignitaries and fashion houses. I had already wired their retainer and secured their luxury travel accommodations to the chateau. I played the same game with a local Austin bakery. I requested a tasting for a simple buttercream cake, making sure my mother knew the exact name of the shop. 2 days later, Harper booked their entire weekend production capacity, forcing them to decline my order. Meanwhile, a renowned pastry chef in Marseille was currently designing a towering croquembouche spun with gold sugar threads for my reception. I kept Harper chasing shadows, expending her energy on local vendors, so she would never look up and see the sky falling. The financial strain in Dallas reached a breaking point by late April. The prestigious country club required a monumental deposit to finalize the sprawling tent installation and secure the exotic catering menu. The venue management sent a sternly worded invoice warning that failure to pay within 48 hours would result in immediate cancellation of the reservation. Charles sat at his heavy oak desk, surrounded by glowing red numbers on his accounting software. He could not ask the bank for another extension. He could not liquidate a portion of his herd without tipping off the local agricultural community to his severe distress. He certainly could not ask the Montgomerys for assistance without exposing his own poverty. My father was cornered by his own hubris. The pride that defined his entire existence was now a suffocating weight pressing down on his chest. If he lost the venue, the wedding would collapse. The resulting scandal would turn him into a laughingstock among the elite social circles he worshipped. The gossip would spread through the country club locker rooms and charity galas, destroying his carefully cultivated reputation. He needed capital immediately, and he had exhausted all traditional avenues. His desperation narrowed his focus until it landed squarely on me. Charles viewed my tech career with benign neglect, but he knew I earned a steady, reliable paycheck. He assumed I lived a frugal Spartan existence because I drove an unassuming sedan and wore unbranded clothing. He calculated that years of working as a mid-level IT manager must have resulted in a modest but accessible savings account. To him, I was not a daughter planning her own future alongside a loving partner. I was an untapped resource, a rainy day fund waiting to be emptied for the benefit of his favorite child. He began rehearsing his pitch in the mirror. He would frame it as a temporary favor, a brief bridge loan to smooth over a minor cash flow issue caused by the ranch. He believed he could manipulate my lifelong desire for parental approval to extract the funds. He thought I would be eager to hand over my hard-earned money just to receive a rare pat on the head and a fleeting smile. He underestimated my intelligence, my resources, and the sheer depth of my detachment. The stage was set for a monumental shift in power. Charles believed he was about to outsmart his naive tech-nerd daughter. He did not realize his impending phone call would hand me the very weapon I needed to dismantle his empire. He was preparing to step willingly into a trap constructed of legal precision and binding contracts. The foundation of the Fox family vanity was crumbling beneath their feet, and they were about to hand me the sledgehammer. The caller ID on my desk phone illuminated on a Tuesday morning. The screen displayed a name that rarely interrupted my working hours. Charles Fox. My father communicated in decrees, not conversations, and he reserved his booming, jovial voice for audiences that could offer him social leverage. A mid-morning weekday call meant the facade was fracturing faster than I anticipated. I let it ring 3 times, allowing the tension on his end to steep before I pressed the green button. His greeting was overly sweet. The artificial warmth in his tone carried the distinct, metallic tang of desperation. He spent the first 2 minutes talking about the weather in Austin, asking benign questions about my commute. This was a man who had never once asked the name of my company. I listened to the hollow small talk, waiting for the pivot. It arrived wrapped in a heavy sigh. He framed his request as a minor logistical hurdle. The ranch was experiencing a temporary cash flow hiccup due to delayed cattle sales. The Dallas Country Club required a sudden, unforeseen deposit to finalize the sprawling tent installation for Harper. He needed a bridge loan. Just a brief infusion of capital to keep the vendors happy until his seasonal dividends cleared. He spoke quickly, trying to minimize the gravity of the numbers. He needed $500,000. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. The silence stretched across the cellular network. I could hear his shallow breathing. Charles assumed my years of working in what he called the computer sector had yielded a tidy stockpile of unspent salary. He saw my unassuming sedan and my lack of designer handbags as proof of extreme frugality. In his mind, I was a diligent squirrel hoarding acorns for a rainy day. He believed he was merely asking to borrow a fraction of my life savings to fund my sister's single weekend of glory. I did not laugh. I did not point out the hypocrisy of a father asking his forgotten daughter to finance the very event designed to erase her. I kept my voice perfectly neutral, soft, and compliant. I told him I could likely liquidate some stock portfolios to assist the family. I heard the audible rush of air escaping his lungs. The relief was palpable. He praised my loyalty, calling me a good, dependable girl. I added one condition. I explained that because the funds were tied up in mutual funds, the withdrawal required a formal promissory note for tax purposes. Just standard paperwork, I assured him. I needed a secured asset listed on the document to satisfy my brokerage requirements. I suggested the Hill Country Lake House. Charles chuckled. The sound was thick with condescension. He found it endearing that his quiet daughter wanted to play corporate businesswoman. The lake house was his prized possession, a sprawling cedar and glass retreat perched on a prime waterfront lot. It was the physical embodiment of the Fox family legacy. It was also the exact location Harper had loudly claimed for her post-wedding honeymoon getaway. Charles agreed to the terms without a second thought. He was too arrogant to believe I possessed the intellect to outmaneuver him. I ended the call and immediately dialed my wealth management firm. These were the elite corporate attorneys who had successfully negotiated the 8-figure acquisition of my data infrastructure startup. They were not local family lawyers. They were apex predators in bespoke suits. I instructed them to draft a commercial-grade promissory note. The interest rate would be standard, but the conditions of default would be lethal. I directed my lead counsel to embed a specific mechanism deep within the terms, a cross-default clause. This legal provision dictates that if the borrower defaults on any other financial obligation to any third party, the primary loan accelerates and becomes due in full immediately. If Charles bounced a single check to a caterer, a florist, or a valet service, my $500,000 loan would instantly default. The penalty for default was the immediate forfeiture of the collateral, the deed to the lake house. The documents were couriered to the ranch the following morning. They arrived in a sleek, heavy envelope requiring a signature upon delivery. Charles was standing in his foyer, surrounded by floral samples and frantic event planners when the courier handed him the clipboard. He was panicked, rushed, and entirely focused on keeping the Montgomery family satisfied. A prudent man would have handed a 50-page financial contract to his own legal counsel for review. But Charles was blinded by his own hubris. He viewed me as a subordinate, not an adversary. He flipped directly to the final page, clicking his expensive fountain pen and scrawling his signature across the dotted line. He did not read the dense paragraphs detailing the cross-default clause. He did not notice the ironclad language granting me the right to seize his property without a prolonged judicial review. He handed the clipboard back to the courier, believing he had just secured his salvation. He had no idea he had just legally handed me the keys to his favorite asset. The executed contract arrived on my desk by noon. I reviewed his hurried signature, tracing the ink with my index finger. The trap was locked. I opened my secure banking portal and initiated the wire transfer. The funds moved from my hidden holding company into his checking account. To me, the sum was a minor line item in a vast, diversified portfolio. To him, it was a lifeline thrown into a raging ocean. He spent the money almost instantly. Within hours, he wired the exorbitant deposit to the Dallas venue, securing the massive industrial air conditioning units and the hand-carved ice swans. He paid the luxury caterers and the imported silk vendors. He breathed a deep sigh of relief, ignorant of the legal noose tightening around his neck. He was happily purchasing his own ruin using my capital. With his financial compliance secured and the legal snare hidden safely in my files, I was finally free to initiate the next phase of my strategy. I no longer needed to hide my own wedding preparations. It was time to reveal a glimpse of my reality to the rest of the world. I opened a heavy cardboard box sitting in the corner of my office. Inside lay the physical manifestations of my quiet victory. The invitations for my wedding in Provence. They were not digital prototypes or glossy generic printouts. They were crafted from thick, cream-colored cotton paper, possessing a weight that demanded attention. The edges were hand-torn, offering a subtle rustic elegance. The text was pressed into the fiber using a vintage letterpress, creating a tactile depression in the paper. The wording was stark elegant and devoid of any desperate plea for attention. Lindsay and Ethan request your presence for a weekend in Provence. There was no mention of the $14 million chateau. There were no boastful details about Michelin-starred chefs or private string quartets. The luxury was implied in the quality of the materials and the location itself. I sealed each envelope with a bespoke wax stamp, pressing my thumb against the warm red emblem. I selected the recipients with surgical precision. I addressed envelopes to the core engineering team who helped build my fortune. I addressed envelopes to Ethan's kind, supportive parents. Then I turned my attention to the Fox family tree. I bypassed the social climbers and the status-obsessed cousins. I addressed envelopes to our sensible aunt, who ran an accounting firm. I addressed them to my godparents, who had always treated me with genuine warmth. I addressed them to the prominent relatives who historically despised Diane's shallow country club politics. I gathered the heavy stack of envelopes, placing them into a leather satchel. I walked out of my office building and down the sunlit Austin pavement toward the central post office. The air felt crisp and full of electricity. Dropping those envelopes into the brass mail chute was not just an act of wedding etiquette. It was a declaration of independence. Those sealed letters were currently traveling through the postal system, ticking time bombs, waiting to land in the mailboxes of our mutual relatives. When they tore open those wax seals and read the destination, the whispers would begin. They would look at their calendars and realize the dates matched perfectly. They would be forced to choose between a sweltering generic tent in Texas and an exclusive, mysterious weekend in the south of France. The foundation of Harper's carefully curated guest list was about to crack, and the fallout would shatter the fragile illusion my parents had sacrificed everything to protect. The delivery of the mail in the affluent neighborhoods of Texas usually goes unnoticed. It is a quiet, daily ritual performed by postal workers navigating wide suburban streets. But on a Tuesday afternoon, the arrival of my heavy cream-colored envelopes acted as a silent detonation across the state. My Aunt Susan was the first to receive hers. Susan built a highly profitable accounting firm from the ground up. She favored tailored pantsuits over designer gowns and despised the shallow pretension my mother Diane so desperately cultivated. Susan stood in her pristine kitchen, running a thumb over the hand-torn edge of the cotton paper. She read the letterpress ink. "Lindsay and Ethan request your presence for a weekend in Provence." There was no mention of the limestone fortress. There was no boastful itinerary printed in gold foil. It was a simple, elegant request from a niece she genuinely loved. Susan walked over to her calendar. She looked at the date, circled in red ink, for Harper's extravagant country club gala. Susan reached into her drawer, pulled out a black pen, and crossed a heavy line through Harper's event. She filled out my response card, checked the box for attending, and placed it back into the mail. She did not hesitate. Over the next 48 hours, my phone began a steady rhythm of subtle vibrations. Each notification represented a formal acceptance from the most discerning members of the Fox family tree. My cousin Rachel, a woman who routinely mocked Dallas high society politics, submitted her response. My godparents, Robert and Elaine, retired executives who valued authenticity over spectacle, secured their attendance. The defection was immediate and surgical. I had not invited the peripheral cousins who chased free champagne. I targeted the quiet pillars of our family. The relatives who possessed actual generational wealth rather than maxed-out credit cards. When they began submitting their formal regrets to Harper's sprawling 300-person guest list, the panic in Texas ignited. Harper was sitting in my parents' formal dining room, reviewing her seating chart, when the cascade of declines registered. She stared at the digital spreadsheet, her manicured nails tapping frantically against the keyboard. The people she needed to impress the relatives Preston Montgomery's family expected to network with were bailing. Her reaction was explosive. She hurled her tablet across the dining table, knocking over a crystal vase. She refused to believe the defection was genuine. She paced the hardwood floor, spinning a frantic narrative to soothe her bruised ego. Harper declared my invitations were fraudulent. She told Diane that I was sending fake luxury invites to steal her thunder. She insisted I was trying to lure our family to a cheap European park to sabotage her high society triumph. Diane absorbed Harper's hysteria and immediately weaponized it. My phone rang while I was sitting in a high-level board meeting, finalizing the transfer of my tech holding company assets. I stepped out into the glass-walled corridor of my Austin office building and accepted the call. My mother's voice was a shrill, frantic pitch. She abandoned any pretense of Southern charm. "Lindsay!" she shrieked, echoing down the cellular line. "What kind of manipulative game are you playing? You are tearing this family apart over a date? You are guilting your aunt and your godparents into draining their bank accounts to buy expensive international flights? They feel sorry for you. Do you enjoy forcing them to choose between your backyard French picnic and your sister's actual wedding? I stood looking out over the city skyline. I listened to the desperation rattling in her lungs. She was terrified of looking foolish in front of the Montgomerys. She needed my guests to fill her empty chairs. I did not raise my voice to defend my choices. I did not argue about the legitimacy of my venue. Engaging with her anger would only validate her sense of authority. I understand your concern, Mom, I replied, my tone smooth and detached. I will handle the travel arrangements immediately. I ended the call before she could formulate a rebuttal. I walked back to my desk and opened my encrypted laptop. I did not cancel my invitations. I escalated the logistics. I contacted a premier aviation charter broker based in Geneva. Within 15 minutes, I secured a long-range heavy jet. The aircraft featured a custom leather interior, dedicated flight attendants, and an executive dining cabin. It would depart from a private terminal at Dallas Love Field on the Thursday prior to the wedding and land directly in Nice, France. I drafted a brief, precise email to my confirmed guest list. I did not mention Harper's temper tantrum. I did not complain about my mother's frantic phone call. The message read simply, "Please find your tailored travel itinerary enclosed. A chartered flight has been secured for your comfort. All transportation from Dallas to Provence is fully accommodated. We look forward to hosting you." I pressed send. The email landed in inboxes across Texas. When Aunt Susan read the itinerary over her morning coffee, she let out a loud, sharp laugh. She immediately forwarded the details to Rachel. By noon, the whispers circulating through the Dallas Country Club underwent a profound paradigm shift. For months, Diane had curated a narrative of pity around my existence. She told her tennis partners I was a stubborn mid-level IT worker scraping together pennies to elope out of spite. The aviation email shattered that carefully constructed illusion. Mid-level IT managers do not charter transcontinental heavy jets for their wedding guests. The socialites Diane sought to impress stopped offering her sympathetic smiles. They began asking probing questions. Pity transformed into an insatiable, burning curiosity. The Montgomery family, hearing the rumors of private aviation, began casting sideways glances at Charles, demanding to know why his supposedly wealthy ranch was struggling to pay for ice sculptures while his forgotten daughter was commanding international flights. Harper felt the controls slipping through her fingers. The spotlight was drifting across the Atlantic. She could not compete with the mystery and sudden prestige surrounding my event. Driven by a volatile mix of panic and envy, she resorted to the only weapon she understood: public sabotage. Harper reached out to the editor of a prominent Dallas society blog. The publication thrived on local scandals tearing down reputations for clicks. Harper granted them an exclusive, anonymous interview. She fed them a highly stylized piece of fiction, portraying herself as the victimized, glowing bride. The article published the following morning under a glaring headline: "A Tale of Two Sisters, How Bitter Jealousy is Ruining a Dallas High Society Wedding." The text was a masterpiece of character assassination. Harper claimed I was an estranged, deeply envious spinster. She alleged I purposely scheduled a competing event to drain resources away from her union with Preston Montgomery. She painted my French wedding as a desperate cry for attention, a fraudulent scheme designed to embarrass the family. She thought public shame would break me. She believed dragging my name through the digital mud would force me to cancel my plans and retreat into the shadows. Harper operated under the assumption that I shared her desperate need for public validation. I read the article while drinking a cappuccino in my kitchen. Ethan stood over my shoulder, skimming the harsh accusations. He shook his head, setting a hand on my shoulder. "She is burning her own house down," he murmured. I nodded, closing the browser tab. Harper intended to humiliate me. Instead, she provided a masterclass in strategic miscalculation. By involving the local press, she guaranteed that every wealthy family, every vendor, and every socialite in the city of Dallas was now paying strict attention to May 14th. They were all watching, waiting to see if the jealous older sister would fail. Harper wanted an audience for her triumph. She had no idea she had just successfully sold front-row tickets to her own spectacular ruin. The stage was set, and the Texas sky was about to deliver a brutal, unforgiving reality check. May in Texas usually offers a brief window of tolerable warmth before summer truly begins. But 7 days before the 14th, the atmosphere above Dallas shifted in a brutal, unpredictable manner. A high-pressure system stalled over the plains, trapping the city beneath a dome of stagnant, suffocating air. The temperature climbed to 104 degrees. The humidity transformed the sprawling, manicured lawns of the prestigious country club into a sweltering swamp. I monitored the meteorology reports from my tablet while sitting in the first-class cabin over the Atlantic. Harper had demanded a translucent marquee, a greenhouse essentially. Now it was baking in the relentless, unforgiving sun. The landing gear of our plane touched down in Marseille, bringing an end to the Texas noise. Stepping off the tarmac, Ethan and I were greeted by a perfect 72-degree Mediterranean breeze. It carried the crisp, distinct scent of crushed lavender and distant sea salt. It was a far cry from the exhaust and melting asphalt of my hometown. We rode in quiet comfort as the vehicle wound through the rolling hills of the Rhône Valley. When the wrought iron gates of the Château de la Roche parted to welcome us, my lungs finally expanded to their full capacity. I stepped out onto the wide gravel driveway. The ancient limestone felt cool under my palms as I brushed my hand along the entrance archway. The estate manager stepped forward, bowing his head slightly. "Welcome home, Madame Fox." Madame. The title settled over me like a tailored silk coat fitting perfectly. Growing up, I was always the afterthought. The girl handed a juice box while Harper was poured sparkling cider. The one instructed to stand slightly out of frame during family portraits so my sister's pageant gown could catch the light. My parents conditioned me to accept the margins of their lives. Now, standing in the courtyard of a 17th century fortress, I realized they had done me an unintended favor. By banishing me to the shadows, they forced me to learn how to build my own illumination. I did not need their flashbulbs. I possessed the sun. Back in the suffocating heat of Dallas, my father was sweating through his bespoke suit. The transparent tent Harper insisted upon was trapping the solar radiation, turning the interior into a furnace. The country club event coordinator informed Charles that without emergency climate control, the venue would be uninhabitable. The catered food would spoil rapidly, the guests would faint. Charles was presented with a vendor invoice for industrial-grade cooling units. The total cost was $40,000. He had already spent the $500,000 bridge loan I provided. He had zero liquid assets remaining. Driven by panic and the terrifying prospect of social humiliation, he pulled out 3 separate high-interest credit cards. He split the charge across all 3, praying to any deity listening that they would not decline. The desperate credit card maneuver did not go unnoticed. Preston Montgomery's parents, Theodore and Constance, were old money snobs who communicated in whispered judgments. They possessed a keen radar for financial distress, having built their own fragile real estate empire by spotting weakness in others. Constance happened to be standing near the venue management office when Charles was frantically swiping his plastic to cover the cooling units. The facade cracked right down the middle. The Montgomerys prided themselves on merging with a cash-rich ranching dynasty. Watching Charles Fox beg a credit terminal to authorize a high-interest transaction shattered their illusion. Theodore realized he was not aligning his over-leveraged family with a wealthy partner. He was shackling his son to a sinking stone. While the air in Dallas turned toxic, my chartered heavy jet touched down in Nice. The carefully curated list of my loyal relatives disembarked. Aunt Susan stepped out of the luxury transport van and stood on the driveway of the chateau. For a woman who spent her life analyzing numbers and identifying financial discrepancies, she was rendered speechless. My cousin Rachel walked up beside her, staring at the towering stone turrets and the sprawling, vibrant gardens. I stood on the front steps, waiting for them. There was no boastful announcement. I did not wave a property deed in their faces. I simply smiled and invited them inside to rest. Watching their eyes widen as they took in the vaulted ceilings and the curated antique tapestries provided a quiet, profound satisfaction. The timeline had officially splintered into two irreconcilable realities. In France, my guests were guided to their private suites overlooking the vineyards. They were handed chilled flutes of local wine and offered trays of artisan cheeses. The environment was curated for peace. The architecture itself demanded tranquility. In Texas, the environment was actively hostile. The emergency cooling generators arrived at the country club, but they were incredibly loud. They rumbled like freight trains, drowning out the delicate string musicians Harper had hired for her cocktail hour rehearsal. The tension between the Foxes and the Montgomerys ignited before the rehearsal dinner even began. Theodore Montgomery cornered my father near the country club bar. He demanded to know the true state of the ranch's finances. Charles backed into a corner, blustered and deflected, leaning on his usual loud bravado. But bravado does not pay catering bills. Constance Montgomery pulled Harper aside and offered thinly veiled insults regarding the tacky, transparent tent and the deafening roar of the rented air conditioners. The two families who had spent the last year pretending to be elite royalty were now circling each other like stray dogs, fighting over a discarded bone. Harper felt the walls of her perfect narrative closing in. The suffocating heat, the glaring in-laws, the sudden realization that her event was turning into a logistical nightmare, all piled onto her fragile shoulders. She needed a scapegoat. She needed someone to absorb her frantic anxiety. Her fingers flew across her phone screen, seeking the one person she always used as an emotional punching bag. My phone vibrated against the heavy oak table in the chateau library. I unlocked the screen. The text from my sister consisted of a single, bitter sentence. "I hope your cheap little French picnic gets rained out." I read the words twice. I did not feel a spike of adrenaline. I did not feel the urge to type a blistering response. I looked around the room. The shelves were lined with leather-bound volumes detailing centuries of European history. Outside the window, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless azure. The air smelled of expensive wine and blooming flowers. I set the phone face down on the 400-year-old marble surface. I picked up a crystal glass, poured a generous measure of vintage Bordeaux, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The storm was already raging across the ocean, tearing through the fragile paper houses my family had built. But for the first time in my life, it was not raining on me. The evening before a wedding always reveals the true foundation of a family. In Dallas, the foundation was actively crumbling under the weight of a historic heat wave and unpaid bills. Harper selected an upscale steakhouse renowned for dark wood paneling and exclusivity for her rehearsal dinner. It was a venue designed for quiet, wealthy indulgence. But on this specific Friday, the atmosphere inside the private dining room mirrored the suffocating humidity outdoors. The air conditioning system struggled to cool the bodies packed into the enclosed space. Condensation dripped down the heavy glass windows. My father Charles sat at the head of the long table. He tugged at the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. The fabric was damp with sweat. His usual booming laughter was absent, replaced by a grim, tight-lipped silence. Across the table, Theodore and Constance Montgomery radiated disdain. Theodore built his real estate portfolio by identifying vulnerable assets and exploiting them. He recognized the scent of financial decay. He stared at my father with the cold calculation of a creditor evaluating a bad debt. Constance barely touched her wedge salad. She spent the evening leaning close to her friends, whispering pointed critiques about the cheap table linens and the sweltering temperature of the room. Harper tried desperately to maintain the illusion of control. She laughed too loud. She posed for photos holding a crystal wine glass with white knuckles. She was performing the role of the glowing bride while the stage burned down around her. Preston sat beside her, looking less like a devoted groom and more like a hostage, calculating his escape route. He had realized the Fox family fortune was a mirage. He was marrying into a sinking ship. Then the fatal blow arrived. It was not delivered by a relative or a rival socialite. It came in the form of a stressed, exhausted floral designer holding a leather ledger. The woman pushed her way past the steakhouse hostess and marched directly into the private dining room. She did not lower her voice to accommodate the fragile social sensibilities of the guests. She walked straight up to Charles. "Mr. Fox," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut the humid air. "The final payment for tomorrow's centerpieces was returned by your bank an hour ago. Insufficient funds." The silence that fell over the room was sudden and suffocating. The clinking of silverware stopped. Every eye at the table turned toward my father. Charles turned a deep shade of crimson. He sputtered, attempting to wave her away. He stammered something about a bank error, a clerical mistake that would be rectified in the morning. The floral designer did not flinch. She had dealt with fake Dallas wealth before. "There is no morning," she replied firmly. "Unless I have a certified cashier's check in my hand right now, my team will not be setting up those arrangements tomorrow. We are done." She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving a toxic silence in her wake. The implications of that brief exchange were profound. For Harper, it meant her lavish reception would feature bare tables. For Charles, it meant total public humiliation. But for me, sitting an ocean away, it meant something entirely different. The bounce check was the exact legal trigger required to activate the cross-default clause in my promissory note. My father had just legally forfeited his prized hill country lake house. The trap had snapped shut. While Charles choked on his own hubris in a Texas steakhouse, twilight settled over the Rhone Valley in Provence. The air cooled to a perfect, gentle temperature. A light breeze carried the scent of wild thyme and roasting garlic through the courtyard of the Château de la Roche. I hosted my rehearsal dinner outdoors, beneath the canopy of ancient olive trees. We did not need dark wood paneling to prove our worth. The 17th century limestone walls, bathed in the soft glow of hundreds of candles, provided an elegance that money could not manufacture. My guest list was intimate and loyal. Ethan sat beside me, holding my hand under the table. His parents laughed softly at a joke told by my Aunt Susan. My cousin Rachel clinked her glass with the lead engineers from my former tech startup. There was no posturing. There were no hushed insults or calculating glares. The people gathered at my table were there because they valued authenticity. One of the attendees was a woman named Geneviève. She was the plus one of my former lead software developer. She also happened to be a senior editor for a premier international bridal magazine based in London. Geneviève possessed a trained eye for luxury. She had attended royal weddings and exclusive celebrity galas across the globe. She spent the entire evening observing the intricate details of the courtyard. She admired the hand-carved stone fountains, the centuries-old vines climbing the archways, and the effortless grace of the waitstaff. As the main course of duck confit was cleared away, Geneviève leaned across the table. Her eyes reflected the flickering candlelight. "Lindsay," she said, her voice carrying a genuine tone of awe. "The architecture here is breathtaking. The history is palpable. Who did you rent this incredible estate from? It must be impossible to secure a weekend reservation during this season. The conversation around our end of the table quieted. Aunt Susan paused with her wineglass halfway to her lips. Rachel leaned forward. They knew I had orchestrated this beautiful weekend, but they assumed I had simply spent a portion of my savings on a lavish rental. My parents had conditioned the entire family to believe I was a frugal, modest employee. The idea that I possessed actual wealth was a concept they had never been forced to consider. I picked up my glass of vintage Bordeaux. I swirled the deep red liquid, watching it catch the light. I did not boast. I did not raise my voice to ensure the entire courtyard heard me. I looked directly at Geneviève and delivered the truth with calm, quiet precision. "I did not rent it," I said. "I bought it 2 years ago." The reaction was a beautiful, delayed wave of comprehension. Geneviève blinked her professional composure, slipping into genuine shock. Rachel gasped a sharp intake of breath that echoed in the quiet evening air. Aunt Susan set her wineglass down on the linen tablecloth and stared at me. Her pragmatic accounting brain rapidly calculated the kind of capital required to purchase a historic French fortress outright. A slow, proud smile spread across her face. Then the applause started. It began with Ethan's father clapping his hands in quiet delight. The sound rippled down the table. The tech engineers cheered, raising their glasses. Joyous tears welled in Rachel's eyes. There was no jealousy. There was only awe and profound respect. They were celebrating a woman who had quietly built an empire while her family tried to erase her. The applause echoed off the ancient limestone, drifting up toward the stars. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to the reality unfolding back home. Because at that exact moment, a very different kind of noise was echoing through a steakhouse parking lot in Dallas. The rehearsal dinner had imploded immediately after the florist departed. Preston Montgomery followed my father out the heavy glass doors into the sweltering night air. The polite veneer of high society etiquette evaporated. Preston cornered Charles between a row of luxury sedans. His voice echoed across the asphalt, filled with rage and betrayal. "You lied to us," Preston shouted. "You paraded around the country club acting like Texas royalty, and you cannot even pay for flowers? Your ranch is bleeding dry." Charles tried to puff up his chest, attempting to reclaim his usual loud dominance. He pointed a trembling finger at his new son-in-law. "Do not speak to me like that, boy. You need my family name just as much as we need yours. Your father is up to his neck in commercial debt. You are nothing without this merger." The two men stood inches apart, screaming accusations into the humid night. Harper stood near the entrance of the restaurant, sobbing into her hands, while Constance Montgomery looked on with undisguised disgust. The facade was entirely broken. The families were tied together by contracts and social expectations, but they loathed each other. Tomorrow was the wedding day. The guests would arrive, the cameras would flash, and the illusion would have to be maintained. But the foundation was already shattered. The anger brewing in that Texas parking lot guaranteed that the following afternoon would be a spectacular disaster. And they had no idea that their worst nightmare was already scheduled to broadcast directly to their phones. May 14th arrived with a punishing, glaring heat. In Dallas, the morning sun baked the asphalt, radiating a suffocating warmth that defied the early hour. The local meteorologists declared it a historic thermal event. By noon, the ambient temperature reached triple digits. The humidity wrapped around the city like a wet wool blanket. The prestigious country club grounds transformed from a pristine, manicured oasis into a sweltering, humid trap. Harper insisted on a translucent pavilion. She envisioned a crystalline structure catching the afternoon light. Instead, the clear vinyl trapped the solar energy, creating a literal greenhouse effect. The industrial cooling units Charles had secured on high-interest credit cards roared against the perimeter. They pumped chilled air into the enclosure, but the relentless Texas sun proved too strong. The internal temperature of the pavilion hovered near 90 degrees before the first guest even arrived. The cracks in my sister's perfect aesthetic materialized quickly. The hand-carved ice swans positioned near the entrance were designed to impress the Montgomery family. By 2 in the afternoon, they began to lose their elegant long necks. The frozen features blurred, dripping steadily onto the imported silk table runners. The elegant centerpieces morphed into sad puddles of lukewarm water. The meticulous, expensive details Charles funded with empty accounts were melting away. The tension behind the scenes mirrored the oppressive climate. Preston and Harper spent their final, unmarried hours engaged in hushed, frantic arguments inside a cramped bridal suite. Preston blamed her for the ridiculous outdoor concept. Harper blamed his parents for their thinly veiled insults regarding the noise of the generators. They were wearing heavy formal attire, sweating through their tailored garments, pacing like caged animals. They were about to pledge their lives to one another while drowning in mutual resentment. Then, the fragile infrastructure surrendered. Just as the string quartet began tuning their instruments, the temporary power grid reached its maximum capacity. The rented generators coughed, sputtered, and died. The sudden silence was deafening. The cooling units powered down. The fans stopped spinning. The pavilion was plunged into a heavy, stagnant darkness. There was no breeze to relieve the suffering. The guests arrived in dark suits and heavy gowns, only to find themselves directed into an unventilated oven. The golden child of the Fox family was about to host her grand high society debut in a dark, sweltering sauna surrounded by angry creditors and furious in-laws. 9 time zones away, my morning began with the gentle sound of birds singing in the ancient cypress trees. The Mediterranean sun rose over the Rhône Valley, casting a soft, golden hue across the limestone walls of the chateau. The temperature was a flawless 72 degrees. A cool, crisp breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine and wild thyme through my open bedroom window. There was no panic. There was no rushing. The air felt light and full of quiet promise. Genevieve, my wedding planner, brought a tray of fresh espresso and warm pastries to my suite. She moved with a practiced calm, orchestrating the day with invisible precision. I sat before a gilded antique mirror while a stylist pinned my hair into a simple, elegant twist. We did not use heavy layers of cosmetics to mask my features. We highlighted the natural radiance that comes from profound peace. My gown hung on a velvet mannequin in the corner of the room. It was not a volatile, explosive statement piece designed to demand attention. Harper favored dresses covered in heavy rhinestones and plunging necklines needing everyone to stare. My dress was a custom creation of pure ivory silk. It featured clean architectural lines, a draped cowlback, and a sweeping train that moved like liquid. It did not need to shout. The quality of the fabric and the mastery of the tailoring spoke volumes on their own. It was a garment fit for a woman who owned the estate she stood within. I slipped into the silk, feeling the cool, smooth material settle against my skin. I did not wear a veil. I wore a single pair of diamond drop earrings, a gift from Ethan. When I walked down the grand curved staircase, my loyal guests were already seated in the lower courtyard. They sat on vintage wooden chairs arranged in a neat semicircle. The aisle was not marked by flashy synthetic runners. It was woven with wild white roses and fresh lavender harvested directly from the surrounding fields. My Aunt Susan caught my eye as I stepped into the courtyard. She offered a warm, proud smile, dabbing her eye with a linen handkerchief. My cousin Rachel beamed from the front row. They were relaxed, comfortable, and genuinely happy. There were no strained smiles or whispered complaints about the climate. Ethan stood at the end of the floral path, waiting beneath a stone archway wrapped in climbing vines. He wore a sharp, tailored, midnight blue tuxedo. When he saw me walking toward him, his breath hitched. The strong, steady man who grounded me through years of family neglect raised a hand to his face. A single tear tracked down his cheek. He did not bother to wipe it away. He let the emotion show, standing tall and vulnerable. I took his hands in mine. The ceremony was brief, intimate, and fiercely personal. We did not recite generic vows downloaded from the internet. We spoke about building a partnership rooted in mutual respect and unyielding support. We promised to protect our peace and to honor the life we had constructed together, away from the noise of expectations. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the applause that echoed through the courtyard was pure and joyous. I turned to face my guests, stepping out of the shadows of the Fox family legacy and into a sunlit future I had financed and built with my own hands. The forgotten daughter was gone. The owner of the Château de la Roche had arrived. As the afternoon shifted into a brilliant twilight, the reception commenced under a canopy of stars. The string quartet played a modern symphony, weaving classical instruments with contemporary melodies. The culinary team presented a masterpiece of a dinner, serving truffle-infused delicacies and rare regional wines. The ambiance was intoxicating, the laughter was authentic. It was time for the final phase of my strategy to snap into place. I caught Rachel's eye across the courtyard. We had discussed this precise moment weeks in advance over a secure phone call. She gave me a subtle nod, pulling her smartphone from her beaded clutch. In Dallas, the country club guests were likely picking at lukewarm food in the dark, sweating through their expensive clothes, while my parents avoided eye contact with everyone. They thought they had successfully isolated me. They believed their social standing was secure, despite the mechanical failures. Rachel opened her social media application. She activated the live video broadcast feature. She did not point the camera at me right away. She started by panning across the towering, illuminated turrets of the 17th century fortress. She captured the waitstaff pouring vintage champagne from crystal decanters. She filmed the Michelin-caliber plates being set before the guests. She documented the sheer, undeniable luxury of a $14 million estate operating at the peak of European hospitality. Then she turned the lens toward the dance floor. Ethan and I were swaying to a slow acoustic melody, wrapped in each other's arms, smiling with effortless joy. Before Rachel pressed the button to publish the live feed, she utilized a very specific digital tool. She tagged my mother, Diane. She tagged my father, Charles. She tagged Harper. She tagged Aunt Susan, who had cleverly shared the digital connection with a dozen high-profile Dallas socialites in the weeks prior. She effectively linked the live broadcast to the entire extended network of the Fox and Montgomery families. The digital transmission flew across the ocean, cutting through the sweltering Texas night. The trap was no longer a secret confined to a few mailed invitations. It was a live public broadcast showcasing the profound, beautiful reality of the daughter they had discarded. The notification chimes were about to ring out in the dark Dallas tent, delivering a visual masterpiece of wealth and triumph directly into the hands of the people who tried to bury me. The darkness inside the Dallas Country Club pavilion was oppressive. The heavy vinyl canopy trapped the sweltering heat, creating an environment that felt less like a high society celebration and more like a punishment. Without the roar of the rented cooling units, the only sounds were the rustle of expensive programs being used as makeshift fans and the low murmurs of disgruntled guests. The emergency battery-powered lanterns cast eerie, unnatural shadows across the faces of the Texas elite. My parents sat at the head table, enduring a slow, agonizing public humiliation. The pristine image they had sacrificed their savings and their oldest daughter to maintain was melting away alongside the ice sculptures. The catering staff attempted a frantic recovery, but the logistics were impossible. The warming ovens had failed an hour prior. Waiters in dark vests navigated the dim aisles, carrying trays of lukewarm chicken and wilted asparagus. They placed the unappetizing plates before the Montgomery family, who stared at the food with unconcealed disgust. Theodore and Constance Montgomery did not touch their silverware. They sat in rigid silence, projecting an aura of supreme regret. They realized the Fox family fortune was a fragile facade, and they were currently trapped inside its collapse. Then a distinct digital chime pierced the heavy, humid air. It was followed by another, then 10 more. A synchronous wave of notification alerts swept through the sprawling tent. Pockets and evening bags vibrated. The guests, eager for any distraction from their physical misery, reached for their devices. The dim pavilion was suddenly illuminated by the cool blue glow of 200 smartphone screens. Sitting beside my father, Diane pulled her device from her beaded clutch. She tapped the screen, opening a social media application. My cousin Rachel had tagged the entire extended family in a live video broadcast. Diane squinted, adjusting her vision to the bright screen. Charles leaned over her shoulder, his brow slick with sweat. They expected to see a grainy, shaky video of a pathetic backyard gathering in Austin. They expected a visual confirmation of their superiority. The high-definition stream began with a soaring aerial view. A drone swept over endless rows of vibrant purple lavender, cresting a gentle hill to reveal a breathtaking 17th-century limestone fortress. The Château de la Roche glowed under a clear canopy of Mediterranean stars. The camera descended smoothly into the courtyard, capturing the sheer, undeniable elegance of the evening. The acoustics of the live stream delivered the flawless melodies of a Parisian string quartet directly into the sweltering Texas tent. Diane stopped breathing. Her screen displayed waiters in tailored uniforms, presenting culinary masterpieces featuring shaved black truffles and vintage wines poured from crystal decanters. The camera panned across the faces of the guests. Diane saw my Aunt Susan and my godparents, the very people she had dismissed and insulted earlier that week. They were not sitting in a cheap public park. They were laughing, relaxed and radiant, surrounded by the kind of authentic European luxury that Dallas socialites spent their entire lives trying to emulate. Then the lens found me. Diane watched her forgotten daughter glide across a stone dance floor, wrapped in Ethan's arms. I wore a custom ivory silk gown that flowed like liquid silver in the candlelight. I was smiling with an effortless joy that could not be manufactured. I looked radiant, wealthy, and entirely unbothered by the absence of my parents. The contrast was a brutal physical blow. While Diane sat in the dark, sweating through her designer dress, she was forced to watch me thrive in a sunlit legacy she had actively tried to destroy. A few tables away, Harper was rigid with fury. The bridal glow had long since melted off her face, replaced by a mask of desperate panic. She noticed the murmurs rippling through her audience. The guests were no longer complaining about the heat, they were whispering about the screen in their hands. Harper glanced over Preston's shoulder. He was holding his phone, staring wide-eyed at the broadcast of my pristine reception. He was absorbing the vast scale of the French estate, tracing the ancient architecture with his gaze. Harper snatched the device from his grip. Her manicured nails dug into the metal casing. She stared at the footage, her cognitive dissonance fracturing her fragile ego. She could not process the reality unfolding before her eyes. The sister she had mocked, the woman she had publicly branded a jealous spinster, was hosting a regal gala across the ocean. Her hands shook uncontrollably. She lifted her crystal champagne flute and hurled it against the wooden dance floor. The glass shattered into 100 jagged pieces. The sharp crash silenced the immediate vicinity. "She rented a castle to spite me," Harper screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "She did this just to ruin my night." Her outburst drew the immediate attention of Theodore Montgomery. Theodore was a ruthless pragmatist. He respected capital above all else, and he possessed a trained eye for identifying true wealth. He had watched the broadcast on his own device, analyzing the undeniable indicators of supreme status. He noted the Michelin-caliber plating, the exclusive European venue, and the relaxed demeanor of the Texas guests, implying chartered international aviation. He connected the dots with lethal speed. Theodore stood up, pushing his chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floorboards. He ignored the shattered glass at his daughters-in-law's feet and walked directly toward my father. The polite veneer of high society protocol dissolved in an instant. Theodore leaned down, placing his hands flat on the table. His voice was a low, calculated growl that carried perfectly through the quiet, hot tent. "You drained your accounts for this swamp?" Theodore sneered, gesturing broad hand toward the melting ice sculptures and the dark, stifling enclosure. "While your other daughter is literal royalty?" Charles opened his mouth, but his throat was dry. He was paralyzed by the sudden, horrific realization of his own folly. Theodore pressed the advantage, his tone dripping with profound disgust. "You paraded yourself around Dallas acting like a tycoon, dragging us into this humiliating circus, and you did not even know your own bloodline possessed this kind of leverage? We aligned ourselves with the wrong sister." The revelation hit the room like a shockwave. Constance Montgomery turned her back on Diane, a silent, damning rejection that severed their social ties permanently. The society bloggers, the country club gossips, the wealthy investors my parents had sacrificed everything to impress were all watching the exchange. They looked from the sweat-stained, panicked Fox family to their glowing phone screens displaying my French triumph. The embarrassment was inescapable. Charles and Diane were stripped bare in front of their entire world. Their vanity, their lies, their desperate financial posturing were exposed under the harsh, glaring light of their own failure. They had bankrupted themselves for a farce while intentionally alienating the one person who actually held the status they so desperately craved. On their screens, the live stream reached its conclusion. Rachel's camera panned up from the dance floor, offering one final majestic shot of the chateau's grand facade, illuminated against the night sky. The video ended, fading to black, leaving the Dallas guests staring at their own reflections in the dark glass of their devices. The trap had officially closed. I had not spoken a single word to them in weeks, yet I had dismantled their entire carefully curated universe. The silence of the Texas night was broken only by the sound of Harper sobbing into her hands and the distant, useless hum of a broken generator. The empire of lies was reduced to ash. In Provence, I stepped off the dance floor, unaware of the exact carnage unfolding in my hometown, but entirely certain of its arrival. I was surrounded by loyalty and the quiet satisfaction of a flawless execution. But I knew the silence would not last. The pride of the Fox family was mortally wounded, and a cornered animal always strikes out. The sun would rise in Europe long before it did in Texas, and I knew exactly who would be waiting on the other end of the telephone when morning broke. The dawn light spilled across the Rhone Valley, painting the ancient limestone in hues of soft gold and pale violet. It was 6 a.m. in Provence. The air carried a brisk chill, settling over the dew-soaked vineyards that stretched outward from the chateau. I stood barefoot on the private balcony adjoining the master suite, wearing a thick silk robe. Inside the bedroom, Ethan slept soundly, tangled in crisp white linens, breathing in the steady rhythm of a man who carried no burdens. I leaned my forearms against the wrought iron railing, holding a small porcelain cup of espresso. The ceramic warmed my palms. The silence of the French countryside was profound. There were no roaring generators, no sirens, no frantic vendors barking orders. There was only the gentle rustle of the cypress trees and the distant call of a mourning dove. 6 a.m. in France meant it was exactly midnight in Texas, the witching hour for Cinderella and her broken glass slippers. My smartphone rested on a small wrought iron bistro table near my elbow. The screen was dark, reflecting the pale morning sky. Then it vibrated. The device hummed against the metal surface, sliding a fraction of an inch. The screen illuminated, casting a harsh artificial glow. The caller identification displayed a single word: Mom. Years ago, that specific caller ID would have triggered a spike of cortisol in my bloodstream. My heart would have raced as my brain scrambled to predict which invisible boundary I had crossed, which minor infraction required an immediate groveling apology. Diane Fox ruled her household through a potent mixture of guilt and conditional affection. You either served her narrative or you were banished to the margins. For 3 decades, I accepted the margins. I picked up the device. I did not feel fear. I felt the cool clinical detachment of a researcher observing a predictable chemical reaction. The social explosion I orchestrated the night before was currently settling into the Dallas asphalt like radioactive fallout. I swiped the green icon across the glass and brought the speaker to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. Lindsay, the name tore through the speaker sharp and jagged. Diane's voice was unrecognizable. The polished, syrupy southern drawl she utilized for country club luncheons had burned away. She sounded hoarse, her vocal cords shredded from what must have been hours of screaming, crying, or performing frantic damage control. In the background, I heard the distinct clink of ice cubes rattling against crystal. She was drinking heavy liquor.
How could you do this?
She shrieked, the volume forcing me to hold the phone a few inches away from my head.
You humiliated us. You humiliated your sister on the most important night of her life.
I took a slow sip of my espresso, letting the bitter, rich liquid coat my tongue. I remained silent.
Do you have any idea what you unleashed?
Diane demanded, her breathing shallow and frantic. The Montgomerys walked out. Theodore stood in the middle of that sweltering tent and insulted your father in front of the entire Dallas registry. Preston is furious. He and Harper left in separate cars. Our friends are whispering about us. The caterers threatened to call the police over the remaining balance, and you were broadcasting a circus across the ocean just to mock us. She was grasping at straws, trying to force the blame onto my shoulders. It was a fascinating psychological defense mechanism. Instead of acknowledging that Charles bankrupted them by trying to impress a fraudulent real estate family, Diane needed to believe my wedding was the catalyst for their destruction. She needed a villain to excuse her own profound vanity.
What kind of sadistic game are you playing?
She continued, her tone morphing from rage into a frantic, desperate mock pity. We saw the video, Lindsay. We all saw the string quartet and the ridiculous estate. How much debt did you put yourself in just to rent that place? Did you empty your retirement accounts to hire those waiters? You strapped yourself to high-interest loans just to show Harper up. You ruined your own financial future for a vindictive stunt. There it was, the coping strategy. Diane's entire worldview hinged on the belief that I was inferior. In her mind, Harper was the wealthy, successful socialite destined for greatness, while I was the drab, modest worker bee. To protect her fragile reality, Diane had to invent a scenario where my French wedding was a reckless, irresponsible financial disaster. She had to believe I rented the chateau using borrowed money. If I was drowning in debt, she could retain her superiority. She paused to take a ragged breath, taking a long swallow from her glass. The silence stretched across the transatlantic line, connecting the quiet vineyards of Provence to a dark, chaotic living room in Austin. I let the silence hold. I wanted her to hear the absence of my guilt. I wanted her to feel the empty space where my apologies used to live. Mom, I said, My voice was smooth, surgical, and devoid of any emotional fluctuation. I did not rent it. The clinking of the ice in her glass stopped abruptly. I own it, I continued, articulating each syllable with precise care. I bought the estate 2 years ago. I paid for it in cash. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, it was a vacuum. It was the sound of tectonic plates shifting beneath her feet. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head as she tried to process the mathematical impossibility of my statement. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. The shriek was gone. Her voice was thin, hollowed out by sudden terror. "You work in computer support. You drive a sedan." I sold my data infrastructure startup 18 months before Ethan proposed. I explained, leaning over the balcony to watch a pair of sparrows land on the stone wall. The acquisition was 8 figures. I signed a strict non-disclosure agreement and structured the buyout through a holding company. My wealth management firm handled the real estate transaction for the chateau. I do not work in computer support, Mom. I built an empire while you were busy trying to erase me. A sharp, ragged gasp echoed through the speaker. It was the sound of a woman realizing she had spent her entire life worshiping the wrong idol. She had sacrificed her dignity, her savings, and her reputation to impress a broke Dallas family, while actively alienating a daughter who possessed genuine, unassailable wealth. The tragedy of her miscalculation was total. She had ruined her favorite child's life by chasing a mirage while ignoring the actual billionaire sitting quietly at her own dinner table. "You," she stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. "You own it." "Yes," I replied. "I own the limestone, the lavender fields, the vineyards, and the roof over my head. I also happen to own the deed to the Hill Country Lake House, but I am sure Dad will explain those logistics to you soon enough." I did not give her the opportunity to ask what I meant by that final remark. I did not want to hear her transition from shock into sycophantic begging. The conversation had served its purpose. The illusion was dead. "I am going to go have breakfast with my husband now," I said, my tone pleasant and final. "Do not call me again." I pressed the red icon on the screen, severing the connection. I stood on the balcony, feeling the morning sun warm the skin on my arms. The weight of 30 years of familial expectations evaporated into the crisp French air. I turned and walked back into the master suite, sliding the glass door shut behind me. Ethan was stirring, stretching his arms above his head. He blinked his eyes open, offering a sleepy, contented smile. "Who was on the phone?" he murmured, his voice rough from sleep. "Just tying up a loose end," I replied, setting my empty espresso cup on the nightstand. I climbed back into the warm linens, resting my head against his chest. The confrontation was over, but the war was far from finished. Diane now knew the truth about my resources, but Charles still had to face the legal reality of his financial negligence. The weekend was drawing to a close. Monday morning was approaching fast. When the banks opened in Texas, the cross-default clause buried deep within his promissory note would trigger. The fallout from the bounced catering checks was about to activate a legal avalanche, and my father was standing directly in its path. 3 days after the disastrous pavilion reception, the financial reckoning arrived in Dallas. Monday morning banking hours are ruthless. Automated clearinghouses do not care about social standing or country club pedigrees. When the accounts opened for processing, the sheer volume of Charles Fox's insufficient funds triggered a cascade of catastrophic alerts. The final catering check bounced first, then the floral arrangement balance, then the exorbitant venue fee for the Dallas Country Club. The management at the club did not offer grace periods to members who embarrassed them. The general manager dispatched a courier directly to my parents' front door, delivering a formal notice of intent to sue. The document demanded payment in full, plus steep penalty fees, threatening to publicly revoke their membership by the end of the week if the ledger remained unbalanced. Word of the financial collapse spread through the zip code faster than a wildfire. Theodore and Constance Montgomery did not waste a single second attempting to salvage the alliance. Theodore had spent his entire career insulating his fragile real estate portfolio from toxic assets. My father was now a toxic asset. Theodore contacted his trust attorneys before noon. He executed legal maneuvers to sever any shared liabilities, detaching the Montgomery accounts from Preston and Harper's newly minted union. He cut his son off, ensuring the Fox family debt could not infect his own struggling ledgers. Harper and Preston were supposed to be packing for a luxury getaway to the Maldives. Instead, they were trapped inside a leased downtown apartment, surrounded by unopened wedding gifts and mounting past-due notices. Preston married my sister believing she was a wealthy heiress who could fund his golf course lifestyle, while his own father tightened the purse strings. When Theodore severed the trust funds, Preston turned his fury squarely onto his new bride. Their relationship possessed no genuine emotional depth. It was a transaction built on mutual vanity. Now that the currency had evaporated, the transaction was void. Preston had grown up wearing bespoke suits and driving imported cars, funded by a father who leveraged commercial towers to pay for prestige. Harper had grown up practicing pageant smiles, believing her beauty would secure her a throne. They were two actors who had forgotten their lines. Preston hurled a crystal decanter across their leased living room, shattering the glass against the pristine drywall. He accused Harper of trapping him into a fraudulent union. Harper fell to her knees, screaming that he was a coward holding a wallet full of maxed-out credit cards. The fairy tale was dead, replaced by a vicious, toxic war over who was truly responsible for the mounting debt. Back at the ranch, Charles sat in his dark study, staring at a stack of printed emails. The air in his office smelled of stale cigars and fear. He stared at the brass clock on his desk, watching the second-hand tick. Each movement brought him closer to total ruin. The local bank manager had called twice that morning, refusing to extend any further grace on the ranch operating lines. Charles had spent decades cultivating the image of a rugged, wealthy Texas tycoon. He bought rounds of premium bourbon at the clubhouse. He hosted sprawling barbecues to show off his prime cattle. All of it was constructed on a foundation of sand. The wind had finally shifted, leaving him exposed. He had exhausted every line of credit. His pristine reputation, the only currency he truly valued, was reduced to a punchline among his peers. In his desperation, his mind turned toward the daughter he had spent a lifetime ignoring. He remembered the drone footage. He remembered the sprawling limestone walls of the Château de la Roche, the Michelin-caliber catering, and the chartered jet. He calculated the immense capital required to sustain that level of European luxury. His brain warped the reality of my success into a twisted narrative of familial obligation. Charles believed that because he shared my genetic code, he was entitled to a portion of my empire. He thought my quiet demeanor meant I was still the obedient, compliant girl who yearned for a scrap of his affection. He picked up the phone. I sat at a heavy mahogany desk inside the chateau library. The French afternoon sun streamed through tall, arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A leather-bound folder lay closed, resting near my keyboard. The phone rang. I noted the caller identification and let it chime twice before answering. "Lindsay, sweetheart?" His voice carried a sycophantic, desperate warmth. It was the tone of a salesman trying to close a difficult deal. I leaned back in my chair. "Hello, Dad." He cleared his throat. He did not apologize for the ultimatum he sent weeks prior. He did not mention Diane's horrific behavior during the weekend. He dove straight into the manipulation. "We are in a bit of a bind over here, honey. The ranch accounts are temporarily frozen. Just a clerical error with the bank, but it is causing a severe headache with Harper's vendors. The country club is being very unreasonable. I listened to the lies pour through the speaker. I kept my breathing steady. Your mother told me about the estate in France. Charles continued his words, moving faster now. It is quite a property, very impressive. I always knew you had a sharp mind for saving your paychecks. Since you own such a substantial piece of real estate outright, I was thinking we could arrange a solution. You could take out a small mortgage on the chateau, just a brief equity loan to help the family clear up this wedding mess. Harper is struggling, and we need to protect the family name. The sheer audacity of the request hung in the quiet library air. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not congratulate me on my marriage. He wanted me to leverage my sanctuary to pay for the very event designed to humiliate me. He still viewed me purely as a resource. An automated teller machine dressed in a bridal gown. I did not scream. I did not hurl insults. I reached forward and opened the manila folder sitting on my desk. Inside rested the commercial promissory note he had signed weeks ago, the document detailing the $500,000 bridge loan. The paper inside was thick and official. The black ink of his signature stood out stark and undeniable. He had signed it with his expensive fountain pen, the one he always flaunted at business meetings. The ink had bled slightly into the fiber of the page, securing his fate. "Dad," I said, my voice smooth and unbothered, "I will not be mortgaging my home." He stammered, a flash of panic breaking through the sweet facade. "Now, Lindsay, you have to understand the pressure we are under. You have the means to fix this. It is your duty to help your sister." I ran my index finger along the sharp edge of the legal document. "We are not discussing my home, Dad. We do, however, need to discuss the bridge loan. The $500,000 you owe me." The silence on the line grew heavy. He let out a nervous chuckle. "The bridge loan, right. We agreed I would pay that back by the end of the summer. I just need a little more time to liquidate some assets. You know how the cattle market fluctuates." "That is not what the contract stipulates," I replied. My tone was surgical, slicing through his delusion. He tried to maintain his authority. "I am your father, Lindsay. I told you I will handle the repayment when the season ends. You do not need to worry about a few months of interest." I turned to the third page of the contract. The paper rustled loudly near the receiver. "I am not worried about interest," I clarified. "I am focused on the terms of default, specifically the cross-default clause you authorized when you signed the paperwork." "What are you talking about?" he demanded, the fake warmth evaporating entirely. "The clause states that, if you default on any financial obligation to a third party, my loan accelerates," I explained. "It becomes due in full immediately." "I have not defaulted on anything," he lied, his voice pitching higher. I opened a second tab on my laptop. A contact at the Dallas Country Club had gladly shared the gossip regarding the returned payments earlier that morning. "You bounced 3 checks yesterday, Dad," I stated. "The florist, the caterer, and the venue. That constitutes a formal default across multiple vendors. My loan has accelerated. The grace period is over." He started to shout, projecting his fear into the receiver. "You cannot do this. You tricked me. You buried some legal jargon in a stack of papers." "I did not trick you," I countered. "I provided a standard commercial contract. You chose not to read it because you thought you were dealing with a naive tech worker. You thought you could take my money and use it to fund my erasure. Now the bill has arrived." He breathed heavily into the phone. The realization of his trapped position slowly dawned on him. "I do not have $500,000 lying around, Lindsay. You know that. I cannot pay you today." "I know you cannot," I agreed, closing the folder. "Which is why we need to discuss the collateral." The word collateral hung in the transatlantic connection like a drop of poison suspended in a glass of water. For 30 years, Charles Fox operated under the delusion that he held supreme authority over my existence. He dictated the terms. He controlled the narrative. He assigned the value. Hearing his forgotten daughter casually reference the seizure of his prized real estate shattered that lifelong hierarchy. "I cannot pay that right now, and you know that," he barked, his voice cracking under the sudden, immense strain. The fake sweetness, the sycophantic charm he deployed just moments prior, vanished entirely. He reverted to the only tactic he truly understood: intimidation. "Just forgive the loan, Lindsay. You have millions of dollars sitting in the bank. You do not need this money. You are doing this just to punish us." I kept my posture relaxed, leaning back into the ergonomic contours of the leather chair inside my French library. I ran my index finger over the signature line of the thick commercial document resting on my desk. The blue ink from his expensive fountain pen caught the afternoon sunlight. "I do not forgive debts used to disrespect me, Dad," I replied, my tone steady and detached. He unleashed a sharp, ragged breath into the receiver, the sound of a trapped animal realizing the cage door had permanently locked. "I am your father," he demanded. "You owe me a basic level of loyalty." "Loyalty is a reciprocal currency," I countered. "You spent my entire life investing your loyalty exclusively into Harper. You utilized my capital to fund her high society spectacle while actively attempting to humiliate me. You signed a binding legal instrument acknowledging the risks. The promissory note defaults today. Because you bounced a check to Harper's caterer yesterday afternoon, the cross-default clause triggered. The loan accelerated. The full balance is due immediately." He tried to interrupt, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic, desperate rush. "Now, wait a minute. We can work out a payment plan. I can liquidate some equipment. I can sell the new diesel trucks. Just give me a few months to restructure the ranch accounts." I did not raise my voice, but my words carried the weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. "There is no restructuring." I explained with surgical precision that if he could not wire the $500,000 into my holding account by Friday afternoon, I was legally executing my right to seize the collateral. The Hill Country Lake House. A suffocating, heavy silence descended upon the phone line. The lake house was not merely a vacation property to Charles and Diane. It was the crown jewel of their carefully curated Texas facade. It featured sprawling cedar decks, deep water docks, and panoramic views of the water. It was the exclusive backdrop for Harper's highly stylized lifestyle photography. They hosted lavish summer parties there, specifically to induce envy among their country club peers. Losing the ranch would be a quiet, private failure. Losing the waterfront retreat would be a glaring public execution. "You would not dare," he gasped, his voice dropping to a harsh, terrified whisper. "You would not evict your own family from our home." "I already filed the paperwork," I replied. I let those 5 words echo in his ear. I did not need to scream or hurl insults to inflict maximum damage. The sheer, unyielding reality of the legal process was far more devastating than any emotional outburst. I had retained a relentless commercial litigation firm based in Austin. They specialized in swift, ruthless asset recovery. First thing this morning, my attorneys submitted the default notices to the county clerk. The wheels of the judicial system were already turning, grinding his vanity into dust. He funded his own financial ruin using my money. He took my capital and handed it directly to florists, ice sculptors, and venue coordinators to manufacture an illusion for Preston Montgomery's family. He sacrificed his genuine assets for temporary applause. In return, I was legally stripping him of his most beloved possession. The ledger was balancing itself with poetic perfection. "What are we supposed to do?" he stammered, the fight draining out of his lungs, leaving only a hollow, vibrating panic. Where are we supposed to go? That is a logistical issue you will need to discuss with your accountant, I suggested smoothly. The state of Texas mandates a 30-day notice for eviction proceedings. The clock started ticking this morning. You have exactly 1 month to pack your belongings and vacate the premises before the county sheriff arrives to change the locks. The slow, grueling nature of the 30-day legal eviction process was not a bug in the system. It was a feature. A sudden, immediate loss allows the brain to process shock and begin healing. A prolonged, drawn-out countdown inflicts a unique kind of psychological torture. Charles and Diane would have to wake up every single morning inside their beloved sanctuary, knowing the days were slipping through their fingers. They would have to walk across the imported hardwood floors, stare out the custom glass windows, and pack their designer furniture into cardboard boxes while the entire neighborhood watched. They were trapped in a nightmare of their own making. "Lindsay, please," he begged. The words sounded foreign, unnatural, coming from his throat. "Do not do this. Your mother will not survive the embarrassment." I looked out the arched windows of the chateau, watching the breeze ripple through the endless rows of purple lavender. The French countryside offered a profound, enduring peace. I had built this sanctuary by protecting my energy and guarding my boundaries against their constant toxic demands. I was no longer the frightened girl sitting in the shadows of their grand Texas living room, hoping for a scrap of validation. I was a sovereign entity. "You and Mom made your choices," I said, my voice softer now, devoid of anger but carrying an icy finality. "You chose your priority. Now you get to live with the consequences. Goodbye, Dad." I disconnected the call before he could utter another desperate plea. I set the smartphone face down on the desk. The library returned to its quiet, serene state. I closed the manila folder concealing the promissory note and slipped it into a locked desk drawer. The confrontation was officially over. The execution phase had commenced. But a secret of this magnitude cannot remain contained within the walls of a single family for long. The high society circles of Dallas operated on a currency of whispered scandals and shared schadenfreude. My attorneys filing the default notices at the county courthouse meant the foreclosure was now a matter of public record. Anyone with an internet connection and a desire to search the local property registries could access the documentation. Theodore and Constance Montgomery had spent the last 48 hours doing everything in their power to distance themselves from the Fox family disgrace. They were actively searching for leverage, a way to legally and socially insulate their overextended real estate empire from Charles and Diane's sinking ship. Constance possessed a vast network of highly connected friends who thrived on uncovering hidden financial distress. It was only a matter of time before one of those well-connected socialites stumbled across the fresh legal filings. The revelation that the supposedly wealthy Fox family was being foreclosed upon by their own estranged daughter was a scandal too delicious to keep quiet. The Whisper Network was about to activate. The quiet legal paperwork I filed in Austin was preparing to ignite a sprawling public inferno, destroying the very last shreds of Harper's carefully manufactured lifestyle brand. The true humiliation was no longer happening in private phone calls. It was about to become front-page news across the city. Dallas society operates on a currency of whispered scandals and shared misfortune. The elite circles of Texas thrive on identifying weakness and exploiting it to elevate their own standing. Constance Montgomery was a recognized master of this brutal social economy. She spent the days following the disastrous wedding seeking a mechanism to insulate her family name from the Fox disgrace. She needed a scapegoat to ensure her country club peers did not blame the Montgomerys for the dark, sweltering reception. Her private attorneys scoured public county records, searching for any leverage to untangle the finances. They quickly discovered the fresh default filings submitted by my commercial litigation firm in Austin.
The paperwork detailed the severe delinquency and the impending foreclosure of the sprawling hill country lake house. Constance did not keep this lucrative information confidential. She carried the printed legal documents to her weekly charity committee luncheon. She laid the papers on a polished mahogany table alongside silver tea sets and delicate pastries. She ensured every influential woman in her circle saw the undeniable proof of my parents' insolvency. The narrative Constance spun was surgical and deeply damaging. She painted Theodore and Preston as innocent victims, tricked by a fraudulent ranching dynasty. The whisper network activated, with terrifying speed spreading outward like a drop of ink in a glass of clear water. By Friday afternoon, the knowledge of the impending eviction had saturated every locker room, upscale boutique, and charity board in the metropolitan area. The Fox family was no longer a respected institution. They were a cautionary tale. My father's business associates began pulling their investments from his cattle operations. The local bank managers refused to return his desperate phone calls. The facade he had spent 30 years building crumbled into dust over a single weekend. Harper suffered an even steeper fall. She had built an entire digital identity around the illusion of limitless resources. Her lifestyle brand relied heavily on projecting an aura of effortless elite privilege. She routinely posted curated photos of designer handbags, imported cosmetics, and pristine vacation properties to her thousands of followers. They believed she was the ultimate Texas socialite, living a life devoid of hardship. The leaked foreclosure documents shattered that carefully constructed reality. The truth about her chaotic, sweltering reception spread from closed-door charity meetings onto local gossip forums. Anonymous users uploaded blurry photos of the melting ice swans in the dark, humid pavilion and the frustrated, sweating guests. The internet is an unforgiving arena that punishes vanity with swift precision. Harper's comment sections filled with mocking inquiries about her bounced vendor checks and her parents' bankrupt status. Boutique clothing sponsors abruptly terminated their promotional contracts, citing a breach of brand alignment. Luxury cosmetic companies severed their affiliate links, refusing to associate their products with a public financial scandal. She was rapidly transformed from a high society influencer into a local punchline. She was now known simply as the girl whose parents lost their favorite vacation home because they could not afford to pay a floral designer. Harper barricaded herself inside her leased apartment, refusing to answer phone calls or attend social functions. The golden child was experiencing her first taste of genuine, unrelenting consequence. Her fragile ego could not withstand the public scrutiny. She turned her bitterness inward, fighting constantly with Preston over their shared financial ruin and impending social exile. While my sister watched her digital empire crumble, my own triumph arrived on glossy printed pages. Genevieve, the editor, who attended my rehearsal dinner, had mobilized her publishing team with incredible speed. She recognized a captivating story of authentic triumph when she saw one. 2 months after the ceremonies, the International Bridal Magazine shipped its highly anticipated summer issue. The cover featured a sweeping, wide-angle photograph of the Château de la Roche illuminated against the twilight sky. The headline was printed in bold, elegant typography. A tech founder's secret Provence fairy tale. Inside the magazine, an extensive 10-page spread documented every immaculate detail of my wedding. The article praised the refined architectural beauty of the 17th century estate, the Michelin-caliber menu, and the intimate, authentic joy of the guests. Genevieve wrote a glowing editorial piece, highlighting my journey as a female software pioneer who utilized her self-made fortune to curate a breathtaking European sanctuary. The publication included stunning photographs of Ethan weeping at the altar and my loyal relatives laughing under the ancient olive trees. The publication was distributed globally, but its impact in Texas was profound and inescapable. The magazine occupied prime real estate on newsstands in every high-end grocery store, luxury pharmacy, and bookstore in the state. Harper could not purchase a simple cup of coffee without my face staring back at her from the checkout rack. My parents could not walk into their local market without seeing the physical, undeniable proof of their own catastrophic misjudgment. The very society they had sacrificed me to impress was now purchasing magazines that celebrated my victory. The contrast was a daily physical reminder of what they had thrown away. The sheer magnitude of the public shift finally broke my mother's stubborn resolve. Diane realized that the power dynamic had permanently, irreversibly changed. The country club friends who used to return her phone calls were now actively avoiding her at the grocery store. She was isolated, facing the imminent loss of her beloved lake house and watching her favorite daughter spiral into digital infamy. Driven by desperation, she resorted to her oldest and most practiced tactic: emotional manipulation. She sat down at her computer and drafted a lengthy, tearful email to my private address. I received the notification while sitting in the Château library, reviewing quarterly investment reports. I opened the message and read her words with clinical detachment. Diane attempted to rewrite 3 decades of family history in a single frantic document. She claimed she always knew I was destined for greatness. She wrote that my quiet demeanor was actually a sign of deep, profound genius that she had nurtured from afar. She begged for forgiveness, utilizing flowery, dramatic language. She threw Charles under the bus, blaming him entirely for the financial mismanagement. She blamed the Montgomery family for the social hostility, claiming she was merely a victim of their snobbery. She pleaded with me to halt the eviction process, promising that our family could start over and rebuild our bond if I just showed a little grace. The email was a masterpiece of sycophantic desperation. She did not offer a genuine apology for the pain she caused. She only offered an apology for getting caught on the losing side of the chessboard. A younger version of myself might have felt a surge of vindication reading those frantic paragraphs. The old Lindsay might have drafted a blistering response, detailing every slight, every ignored milestone, every cruel comparison to Harper. But the woman sitting in the French countryside understood that engaging with a narcissist only provides them with the attention they crave. Anger is a form of currency, and I refused to spend another dime on Diane Fox. I did not type a reply. I did not block her email address, allowing her to wonder if the message had even been read. I did not forward the message to Ethan or mock her pathetic attempts at reconciliation. I simply moved the email into a digital archive folder and closed the application. I let the silence do the talking. Silence is unassailable. It offers no footholds for an argument. It provides no oxygen to sustain their drama. By ignoring her, I was delivering the ultimate rejection. I was communicating that she no longer mattered enough to warrant a keystroke. The public record of their failure was loud enough to speak for both of us. The foreclosure process continued, without a single interruption. The 30-day window expired, forcing my parents to pack their designer furniture into moving trucks under the watchful, judgmental eyes of their neighbors. Once the eviction was finalized and the title officially cleared, my legal team transferred the deed of the Hill Country Lake House into a corporate trust under my sole control. I sat at my mahogany desk, sipping a warm cup of tea, finalizing the legal documents that severed my parents from the property forever. The board was nearly clear. The final pieces were moving into position. The only remaining question was how I would utilize the very asset they had loved more than their own daughter to deliver the final poetic checkmate. 6 months allowed the dust to settle over the wreckage of the Fox family vanity. By late November, the relentless Texas sun yielded to a bitter, damp chill. The seasonal shift mirrored the cold, harsh reality settling into my parents' new daily routine.
The adrenaline of the immediate scandal faded, leaving behind the grueling, quiet marathon of financial ruin. Harper and Preston finalized their divorce with a swift, clinical precision. The strain of catastrophic debt cracked their shallow foundation in a matter of weeks. Preston faced immense pressure from his father Theodore, who refused to release a single dime from the Montgomery trusts until the marriage was officially dissolved. Preston filed the paperwork, blaming Harper for the fraudulent presentation of her family resources. He packed his designer luggage and abandoned their leased downtown apartment, leaving my sister to face the remaining utility bills and the staggering credit card balances alone. Harper had spent her entire adolescence polishing a fragile tiara, believing her physical appearance and a curated social circle would guarantee a life of effortless luxury. Now she was a 26-year-old divorcee, holding the invoice for a melted ice swan and a broken industrial air conditioning unit. Her digital lifestyle brand was a ghost town. The high-end cosmetic sponsors vanished. The local boutiques ignored her emails. Without Preston's name and without my father's supposed wealth, she possessed no tangible value in the brutal economy of Dallas high society. Unable to afford the downtown rent, Harper packed her belongings into cardboard boxes and returned to the people who created her. But Charles and Diane Fox no longer inhabited the sprawling stone-clad ranch. The bank seized the diesel trucks, the imported leather furniture, and, eventually, the grazing acreage itself. My parents were forced to downsize drastically. They relocated to a cramped, two-bedroom condominium located near a noisy, elevated highway. The walls were thin. The ceilings were low. They shared a communal parking garage where Charles parked a decade-old, used sedan. The man who once measured his worth by the vast perimeter of his cattle fencing now spent his mornings drinking cheap drip coffee on a concrete balcony measuring 4 feet by 6 feet. Diane no longer received invitations to charity galas or country club luncheons. Her phone remained eerily silent. She was terrified to show her face at the local grocery store, fearing she might lock eyes with a former tennis partner. They lived in a claustrophobic prison, constructed entirely from their own hubris. Harper moving into their spare bedroom only amplified the tension. 3 bitter people trapped in a small space, blaming each other for a downfall they collectively engineered. While my family navigated their new grim existence, I finalized the ultimate disposition of the Hill Country Lake House. When the foreclosure process concluded and the title cleared, I assumed full legal ownership of the waterfront property. The standard approach would involve listing the home on the open market, collecting a lucrative check, and walking away. I opted for a different route. I transferred the property deed into a philanthropic trust operating under the umbrella of my tech foundation. I hired a specialized architectural firm to execute a rapid, comprehensive renovation. I instructed the demolition crew to strip away every trace of Diane's heavy wrought iron decor and dark wood paneling. We painted the walls a crisp, bright white. We installed high-speed fiber optic networks and transformed the formal dining room into a collaborative technological workspace. We kept the sprawling cedar decks and the deep water docks, but we fundamentally altered the energy of the space. The estate was no longer a monument to superficial elite posturing. I designated the property as an annual corporate retreat and incubator space for the Austin Women in Technology Initiative. The lake house held an appraised market value of just under $2 million. I extracted the exact $500,000 Charles owed me from the original bridge loan. Every remaining cent of equity value was routed directly into an endowment fund for the charity. The money generated grants and scholarships for brilliant young women pursuing careers in software engineering, data analytics, and aerospace mechanics. I chose this specific demographic because it represented the exact antithesis of the world Harper and Diane worshipped. I funded women who built actual, tangible value in the dark. Women who relied on their intellect rather than a pageant smile. Women who were often ignored or marginalized by a society obsessed with loud, shiny facades. In early December, the foundation hosted its inaugural weekend retreat at the newly renovated property.
30 young female engineers gathered on the cedar deck overlooking the water to celebrate the close of a successful funding round. They brainstormed complex algorithms while sitting on the plush outdoor seating. As the sun began to set over the Texas hills, a caterer served fresh margaritas with salt rims. A few of the attendees snapped photos of the celebration and posted them to their social media accounts, utilizing the location tag for the lake house. Sitting in her cramped bedroom inside the highway-adjacent condominium, Harper scrolled mindlessly through her phone. The algorithm, recognizing her historical connection to the geographical location, pushed the photos onto her feed. Harper stared at the glowing screen. She watched a group of accomplished, independent women laughing and raising glasses on her childhood dock. The exact teakwood dock where she had intended to pose for bridal magazine spreads during her honeymoon. She saw the bright, modern renovations. She saw the name of my tech foundation stamped across the welcome signs. The sting of irrelevance pierced her chest. She was forced to witness her most beloved sanctuary transformed into a monument celebrating the very sister she had spent a lifetime trying to erase. I did not need to text her. I did not need to gloat. The digital breadcrumbs delivered the poetic justice directly into her hands. Thousands of miles away, the winter chills settled gracefully over Provence. The endless rows of lavender fields outside the Château de la Roche entered their dormant phase, resting quietly under the frost, preparing to bloom again in the spring. I sat on the limestone terrace, wrapped in a thick cashmere shawl. A ceramic cup of espresso warmed my hands. Ethan sat across from me at the small iron bistro table reading a financial newspaper. The morning air was crisp, clean, and entirely devoid of noise. I looked out over the vast, sprawling estate. The journey from the stifling heat of that Dallas country club to the profound peace of the French countryside was not a path paved with luck. It was a route carved by strict boundaries and calculated patience. My parents and my sister spent their entire lives chasing a mirage. They worshipped the opinions of wealthy strangers prioritizing a temporary spectacle over genuine loyalty. They believed that by shouting the loudest, they could dictate the terms of reality. They assumed my quiet nature was a symptom of weakness, a flaw they could exploit indefinitely. They wrong. By forcing me into the shadows, they unknowingly handed me the exact tools I needed to build my empire in peace. They taught me how to operate without a need for validation. They showed me the lethal danger of living beyond your means to impress people who do not care about you. They dug their own financial grave and handed me the shovel. I took a slow sip of my espresso, tasting the rich, dark roast. Ethan lowered his newspaper, meeting my gaze. He offered a warm, effortless smile. There was no tension in his shoulders. There was no underlying anxiety about unpaid bills or fragile social standing. We possessed the one currency my family could never afford: authenticity. People often assume that revenge requires shouting. They believe victory looks like a dramatic confrontation, a fiery argument where every grievance is laid bare. But the most devastating response to profound disrespect is the quiet, unbothered removal of your presence. I did not destroy the Fox family. I merely stopped functioning as the structural support beam for their house of cards. I stepped aside and let gravity do the work. Silence is never a white flag of surrender. It is a calculated retreat. It is the space where strategies are formed and fortresses are built. My family chose their priority under the sweltering Texas sun. I chose mine under the ancient stone arches of Provence. And in the end, the quietest person in the room delivered the ultimate checkmate. When I stood on the balcony of my chateau in Provence, the Mediterranean sun warming the ancient limestone, the silence was absolute. It was a silence I had spent years running from,
a silence that once felt like a void in my family's chaotic, Texas-sized life. But in that moment, listening to the morning doves instead of the roar of rented generators and the frantic, heat-stroked arguments of my relatives across the ocean, I realized that silence wasn't a void at all. It was a fortress. It was the space where I had finally learned the true, heavy cost of the American family dream, and more importantly, the price I was no longer willing to pay. In the United States, we are often sold a specific, glossy narrative about family. It's a story printed on holiday cards and broadcasting commercials. The idea that family is an unbreakable bond, a mandatory loyalty that supersedes all else. We are taught that parents provide the foundation, that siblings are our first and longest friends, and that no matter the conflict, blood demands a return to the fold. But my story, the story of a daughter erased, a sister elevated to a fragile pedestal, and parents who bankrupted themselves for a social mirage, forces a painful reckoning with that narrative. It demands that we ask a dangerous question: what happens when the foundation is built on vanity instead of honesty? And what is our responsibility when the house finally collapses? For decades, my parents, Charles and Diane, operated under a flawed, though arguably common, interpretation of parenting values. In their world, success was not measured by character, emotional resilience, or the quiet, steady accumulation of a meaningful life. Success was measured in square footage country club memberships and the volume at which they could broadcast their achievements. They believed that by pouring every resource, financial and emotional, into Harper, they were securing a legacy. Harper, with her pageant smiles and demand for the spotlight, was the vessel for their ambition. I, the quiet one, the one who built systems instead of seeking applause, was merely the background against which Harper could shine. This is a failure of emotional awareness that echoes through countless homes. When parents define their children's worth by external validation, they strip them of their internal compass. They teach them that love is conditional, a transaction based on performance and optics. They taught Harper that she was entitled to the world, leaving her utterly unequipped for the moment the world demanded substance. And they taught me that my needs, my milestones, and my very presence were inconvenient. The lesson. I learned the lesson that ultimately forged my independence is that family responsibility cannot be a one-way street. The traditional structure, where parents lead and children follow, only functions if it is grounded in fairness and honesty. When parents abandon fairness for favoritism, they do not just damage the neglected child, they fundamentally cripple the favored one. Harper was given everything, but she earned nothing. When the illusion of our family's wealth shattered when the heat melted her ice sculptures and the generators failed, she had no resilience. She had only rage, directed at the very people who had built her fragile throne. My parents believed they were guiding her toward a life of elite privilege. Instead, they guided her into a trap of her own making, shackling her to a man who valued her only for the money she didn't possess. This is the tragic irony of their long-term guidance. By prioritizing the appearance of success over the reality of character, they orchestrated their own ruin. They lost their prized lake house, their social standing, and ultimately, the daughter they had sacrificed everything to elevate. And what of my responsibility? Society often dictates that the successful child must return to rescue the drowning family. The narrative of the good daughter demands that I should have forgiven the debt, that I should have smiled and allowed them to continue their charade, sacrificing my hard-won peace to maintain their illusion. But true emotional awareness requires the courage to enforce boundaries, even when it feels like betrayal. When I executed the cross-default clause and seized the lake house, it was not an act of malice. It was an act of profound, agonizing clarity. I realized that giving them more money would not save them. It would only fund their continued delusion. To rescue them would be to endorse the very toxicity that had nearly erased me. I chose instead to let gravity do its work. I chose to donate the proceeds of their vanity to young women who were building actual value in the dark women who, like me, had learned that you do not need permission to be powerful.
This is the uncomfortable truth about raising children and navigating family dynamics. Sometimes the most loving action you can take is to step away and allow the consequences to land. If you shield someone from the fallout of their choices, you rob them of the opportunity to grow. My parents and my sister were forced to face the reality they had created. Whether they choose to learn from it or continue blaming the world for their misfortune is a choice that belongs entirely to them. I am no longer the architect of their salvation. If my story resonates with you, if you have ever felt like the background character in your own family's drama, or if you are simply navigating the complex, often painful reality of building a life on your own terms, I invite you to join our community. Follow Amanda Told Stories for more narratives that explore the messy, beautiful, and sometimes brutal truths of human relationships. We share these stories not just to entertain, but to remind you that you are not alone in your experiences. As I look out over the lavender fields now, I am left with a thought that challenges everything we are taught about the concept of home. We spend so much of our lives trying to build a place at a table where we were never truly welcome. We twist ourselves into shapes that fit the spaces others have left for us, believing that if we are just quiet enough, or helpful enough, or successful enough, we will finally earn our seat. But perhaps the ultimate act of liberation is not demanding a seat at that table at all. Perhaps true freedom is found in the realization that you have the power to walk away, to buy the lumber, and to build an entirely new table of your own. And as you sit there in the quiet sanctuary of the life you have created, you might just find that the people who were meant to be there have already taken their seats. The others. They are still arguing over who gets to sit at the head of a table that is already sinking.